We've heard in the last minute that the former Chancellor, Alistair Darling, has died. This will come as a shock to many people. Of course, he was the final Chancellor of the new Labour years, steering the country through that Great Recession in 2008, 9 and 10. He also played a key role in the Better Together campaign, keeping the United Kingdom together. Some fairly shocking news, no doubt, for many people. But Peter Edwards, your reaction?
First of all, I'm staggered. He was a relatively young man. My thoughts with all his families, I'm sure yours will be. But he had a colossal impact on public life. He was a kind, decent, intelligent man. I believe, if memory serves me right, he was a cabinet minister throughout the entire new Labour government, which is almost unprecedented for not just longevity, but consistency and competence. But then he'll be remembered for those two key points you alluded to. The financial crisis, when there was almost over a single weekend, a bank bailout. And I read his book and he said he came close to panic, but not quite, which was typically Darling-esque understatement, phlegmatic, calm, mature, responsible. And then his Better Together campaign. Most politicians can't have one legacy. He's got two. What a great man.
And Nunziata, had you come across Alistair?
I never met him, but he was a highly, highly respected Chancellor. The 2008 was an extraordinarily bad time for the country. And to think we've just, in the last 3 months, lost two of the greatest Chancellors we've had. Lord Lawson, Nigel Lawson, only just died, and now Alistair Darling. I think these great statesmen are a real loss to our country.
Well, we're speaking to Christopher Hope, our political editor, on that. I'm sure tributes will be flooding in as we speak.
Absolutely. I believe we can cross to Christopher Hope now, joining us from Westminster. This will have come as an enormous shock. Alistair Darling, of course, not a particularly old man, and someone who, in very recent history, was right at the forefront of British political debate.
That's right, he was just 70 when he died. A complete shock to those in Westminster here. Well, no one knew wasn't really aware publicly that he was ill, or that he was approaching anywhere near the end of his life. So I met him several times back in the day when he, of course, ran that Better Together campaign to hold the union together ahead of the Indie-Ref vote in 2014, and also crucially he was a Chancellor during the financial crash in the late 2000s, and really helped to reassure the markets with Gordon Brown at the helm of the country. I think it's a real sadness, I think, when a death like this is announced with almost no notice, and I think he'll be seen as a really a great Chancellor, I think, who also did a lot for the union. I think that those two achievements will be his legacy.
Have we heard anything yet? I don't suppose so, but have we heard anything yet around the circumstances of his passing?
I'm afraid we haven't yet, Emily. No, we're waiting to hear more from the family later today. I mean, he did retire from politics in 2015 when he stood down as an MP. He became, of course, as any Chancellor would, a member of the House of Lords. I saw him around when I worked in Edinburgh for many years back in the start of the century. He was a very unassuming man, a very kind man. He was just a calm, he had rather a rascally sense of humour, and he was great fun to be around. He was understated. He was offered the kind of calmness, I think, during that financial crisis back in the late 2000s, which the country needed. And certainly he was a key figure also during the Better Together campaign. He'll be much missed, and a great shock, I think, to the Labour movement. Sir Keir Starmer is now out on the way to Dubai for the COP28 summit. We'll be hearing more from him, I'm sure, in the next 24 hours, as well as tributes from other senior Tories who wouldn't have known him when they crossed swords in Parliament.
Absolutely. Well, stay with us, Christopher. We're joined now in the studio by our economics and business editor, Liam Halligan, of course, a long-time financial journalist. You knew Alistair Darling well.
I did know him well. I was at his house in Edinburgh quite recently, interviewing him for a documentary for another channel, which I won't mention. Look, Alistair Darling was a pivotal figure in the new Labour movement because he was probably the one really senior person who was very much part of Gordon Brown's camp, but could also talk to and be taken seriously and reasonably by the Blairites as well. you'll know, both of you, you're students of politics, even though you were kids at the time. I was a lobby correspondent during those early New Labour years, and the battles between the Brownites and the Blairites were legion. They were absolutely legendary. But the one figure who could effectively move between the two camps and do deals and smooth over the differences between these two huge smouldering egos of Blair and Brown was Alistair Darling. And the reason he could do that, and the reason he was trusted across the Labour movement, which he was, because in his early days he came from quite a prosperous background. He went to the Loreto School, which is a very kind of upmarket, well-heeled school in Scotland. He was Edinburgh South MP, again quite a prosperous place from 1987 until he left to join the Lords. So he was steeped in left-wing politics. He a self-described trot in his early days, in his student days. He was quite radical and he was quite extreme, but he was also pragmatic and practical. And as he got into the shadow cabinet and as he came into government, he was seen not just within politics, but I think across the country, as a safe pair of hands. He was quite an effective Transport Secretary. And then, as Chris Hope was saying, crucially, he was the Chancellor during the global financial crisis, where I think whatever part of politics you come from, whichever party you vote for, if you're a swing voter, the UK didn't do too badly during the global financial crisis. We really were the place where the world came together to come up with a rescue plan.
And those G20 meetings convened by the UK, where world leaders came to Downing Street. It was remarkable seeing the newly elected President Obama, but also world leaders from all of these significant economies converging on London in those very early days of the crisis to make those key decisions.
I think that's partly because Gordon Brown always had a good eye for a sort of story and drama, and he wanted to put himself at the centre of things. But it was also the fact that London was, and arguably is under many definitions, the financial capital of the world. Certainly the Americans were happy that they weren't meeting in New York. A lot of people blamed the American banking system, the American real estate bubble for that global financial crisis. But look, during that period, and I talked to him about it at length, and many people have written about it, Alistair Darling was very much the grown-up in the room. And that's quite an incredible evolution for somebody who started out at the radical end of Labour left-wing politics.
I was going to ask you about that. You said he was self-proclaimed trot as a youngster, as a youth. How did his ideology evolve?
Well, I think he just came to understand, like a lot of people in that new Labour movement, who I was, lucky as a young journalist to really get to know, people like Robin Cook, people like Alistair Darling, people like Frank Dobson, was a very avuncular figure on the Labour left. As it became clear that these people had been out of power for a generation, they'd been out of power since 1979, the Tory stronghold on British politics, it was very, very tight. And under Tony Blair, they realised, gosh, we've really got a chance of power here. But the New Labour movement was made up of people who realised, rightly, that British elections are won in the centre, and you're not going to win as a radical left-wing Labour government. And so they gradually came more into the centre and turned out to be, pretty good at doing centre, even in some senses, broadly centre-right politics.
And so many parallels that can be drawn to now, where the Labour Party has come back to a place, perhaps, if not across the whole party, certainly around the shadow cabinet table, that is very reminiscent of those early days, pledging to stick to Tory spending limits. They'll face many of the same challenges this government is facing if they get into power next time. What will they need to learn from Alistair Darling?
Well, look at Wes Streeting. You've got a figure there with a tremendous, humble backstory.
Liam, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We will be going to a break, but I just want to thank our panel and, of course, to reiterate that breaking news, the death of Alistair Darling.